We have with us tonight an incredible American military historian who's really examined all theaters of the war in his incredible work so far. But it almost seems that his passion returns to D-Day. And so tonight, John's going to talk about Americans at D-Day. Please join me in a warm welcome for Dr. John McManus.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it. I'd like to thank all of the incredible staff at the World War II Museum for making this tour what it is, and for the honor of being here. I just really appreciate how they're managing the chaos as we saw today, and I'm just filled with admiration. It's an honor to be part of it. I'd like to thank all of you for making this possible, for having the passion of World War II history to be here and be part of this. Many of you, of course, have family ties. It's very personal. I know I've talked with many of you about that. And I'd especially, of course, like to thank our World War II veterans who uprooted themselves to come here. I mean, it's just amazing. So I think it's fair to say the Normandy invasion, just fascinates us to this point. I mean, that'll never change, in my opinion. In the West, at least, it's probably the best remembered event of World War II. And from a Western point of view, probably the most momentous. The invasion, of course, is only the beginning of a larger campaign to destroy Hitler's Germany. But its drama just still resonates with us, all these decades later, as something just still significant in our lives. A kind of before and after moment is how I see it. And from an American point of view, I would argue it marks the beginning, I guess you could say the kind of symbolic beginning of the United States as an internationalist, world-leading economic, military, and diplomatic superpower. The leader of an alliance of like-minded, mostly Western states that are one day going to form an alliance called NATO. And you could argue that to this point, it's been the most successful alliance in history. I see the kernel of it on D-Day, and I think that's one of the reasons why this still resonates with us today. So, of course, my focus tonight will be primarily upon the American experience, but I also want to point out that Operation Overlord, as we've come to call it, is a team effort. I mean, it's just not possible without a full team effort, and that's sort of my point tonight in terms of the importance of an enduring alliance. There are about a dozen nations that contribute something to the Normandy invasion. Over half of them assume fatalities, so literally, with skin in the game. But this alliance needed a leader, and that leader was going to become the United States, if not necessarily on D-Day, because we're still the minority on D-Day in terms of numbers involved. Perhaps in the long term, the campaign that is to follow, ultimately it's going to be about 2/3 American in terms of the economic power, the manpower, the military power. And that's, of course, a harbinger for the future. So in tandem here, it demonstrates the vital importance to U.S. security, I would argue, of alliances and the importance of U.S. involvement in alliances to world peace and stability. I would point out that the last war of any kind of size and duration we fought without allies was the Spanish-American War in 1898. And I think that kind of says something. And I think so D-Day is a really good example of the U.S. as a leading country working as part of a larger partnership. So why was that? Because only one country among the Western allies had the wherewithal, the strength, not just to lead the invasion, but as I mentioned, the campaign that is going to follow. This is why the British really, ironically, have a better sense of what's possible and not possible in 1942 and 3 than do the Americans. The Americans, you remember from our previous lectures and whatnot, wanted to invade earlier on. And I think the British sense, maybe ironically more than the Americans do, that this can't happen, this invasion, until the U.S. is willing to and ready to lead it, and that time is not going to take place until 1944. So tonight, of course, we've had my dear friends and colleagues in the previous lectures and our conversations and discussions have given you the sort of the strategic balance, the training, the preparation, the diplomacy, all that goes into it. Of course, tonight I'm going to get us ashore and get us out of the planes and get us into the nitty gritty, the fighting. So In the West, it is, of course, the invasion. It just so heavily anticipated for months. It's they're, especially in the U.S., people are just constantly kind of speculating about where and when the invasions are going to happen. Similar to the Germans too. In their case, they're guessing, and so is the American public. It is really at the front and center of the American kind of cultural conversation at that point. So it's the kind of event that when it happened, you would remember for the rest of your life where you were and what you were doing when you heard the news. People participated in betting pools. Hard to believe Americans gambling, right? I mean, I know that's shocking. Betting pools are like, you'd get a day or a time or a place or whatever, different kinds of betting pools. Usually it was a day. And so if you had June 6th, I mean, jackpot, you got June 6th, you win. If you had June 5th, you'd be really angry because that was the original invasion date. And of course, weather led to a postponement. So people were doing that. When, of course, the invasion happens and the news breaks in the U.S., the New York Stock Exchange paused for several moments of silence as a kind of a tribute. I mean, I am not aware of any other invasion, and there are many. There are hundreds of American-involved invasions in the course of the war. None other leads to that kind of reaction. Major League Baseball canceled its games for the day. War industries, some of them actually shut down. One of the things we talked about is that round-the-clock war machine that is amping up. The war industry is cranking out all this stuff. In many cases, you've got factories that are working round-the-clock with like 3 shifts of 8 hours apiece. And there are some of them that actually shut down for the day as a kind of moment of contemplation. That tells you something of the importance of the Normandy invasion in the kind of American cultural conversation here. Churches and synagogues were, of course, absolutely packed. And famously, President Roosevelt leads a national prayer. He uses radio, which is, of course, the cutting-edge medium of the time, to read a national prayer for the success of the invasion. And he kind of alludes to the possibility of failure, too, So all of that, is not necessarily common, and it tells you something about the importance of this invasion. So the question, of course, is, where to invade and all that good stuff. We've covered some of that. But I wanted to just add a couple of points of what we've already heard and discussed. Calais versus Normandy, for instance. So Calais, of course, would have been the first choice, as you can see, and ironically enough, coming from a technologically oriented university. I'm not very good with technology, so bear with me. Oops, there we go. So Calais up there, of course, as we've seen by now, would have been the first choice because of its proximity to England, of course. And it's got suitable landing beaches. They're flat enough they can hold the tanks and vehicles and so on and so forth. The road net is really good as you get inland from those beaches, and most notably, of course, it has several port cities like Calais and Boulogne and Dieppe or whatever that can help sustain your armies. It's also close to Western Germany, close to the industrial Ruhr. There are, of course, you're going to have a quick turnaround of your resupply, your air cover. But there's another downside to Calais that I don't think we've mentioned this week. It's physically close enough to England that it's possible the Germans could see an invasion force staging in southeastern England. So that's at least something of a factor in pivoting to Normandy. But the larger factor is Calais is simply too heavily defended. So Normandy is a solid second choice. Because it offers enough of what we need. And, it does offer one advantage. The other advantage Calais doesn't have. Calais, of course, you're going straight to Germany if you invade there. If you invaded Normandy, the tendency is to pivot via Paris, which is, of course, I think as many of you know, about 2 hours, to south of Normandy. So that means liberation for the French capital, for France itself, political stability in France, perhaps, versus going straight into Germany, and you're then cutting off a lot of German forces and a lot of the French population behind your armies and leading to that kind of challenge. So in terms of like where and when the invasion is coming, keeping the Germans guessing, of course, that's the big game. And what Eisenhower's task is, as commander, in order to maximize the success of this invasion, is to isolate the battle area. Wherever you invade, of course, the Germans can focus on it. And they could theoretically, at least, since this is a continental littoral operation and they control much of that continent, they could get their reaction forces to wherever you're invading, where you're potentially quite weak, and they could exert maximum pressure and they could annihilate your beachhead if they have a good sense of time and place and mobility. Okay, so you've got to then isolate the battlefield, and there's two primary ways of doing that. One of them is a deception plan called Operation Fortitude, which is designed to keep them guessing as to the time and place. Fortitude North, and I'm only summarizing. I mean, we could spend an entire night on just Fortitude. It's fascinating. But Fortitude North attempts to convince them that an invasion is coming in Norway with the purpose of linking up with the Soviets coming from the other direction and then outflanking Germany from the north. So that's supposedly the British Fourth Army staging in Scotland. More famous is Fortitude South, which attempts to convince them that the 1st U.S. Army Group, this massive force under Lieutenant General George Patton, is staging in southeastern England for the purpose of invading at Calais. And, of course, there's all sorts of cloak and dagger stuff and whatever the rest. Fortitude South especially is a partial success. The Germans do have some sense that there could be an invasion of Normandy, but yes, they are guessing. And even after the invasion, some of them think there's a subsequent invasion coming, the real invasion, quote unquote, coming at Calais or whatever. So there is some success to that. But really the larger base point of isolating the battlefield comes from something more controversial and more destructive. And I think that my friend Mark Calhoun mentioned it last night, the transportation plan. So I wanted to delve into that a little bit more and give you a sense of what that really meant. The transportation plan was designed to basically destroy the infrastructure, obviously the transportation infrastructure, so railroad marshaling yards, bridges, highways, depots, and the like in northern France and portions of Belgium. Purpose, of course, is to isolate the battle area in Normandy and to stop German mobility. Okay, but to do that, you've got to drop bombs on a friendly population. And that's why, of course, they have to go to the Free French and ask them, what do you think about this? Because it means that you are going to kill friends. And so the Free French, or their viewpoint is, yes, we're going to have battle losses. We will accept losses for our own liberation. It's not a hard decision. But to the average French citizen, it may not be that cut and dried. If it's the bombs coming down on your house, on your property, your family, the dynamic is different, isn't it? And there's something in the order of about 19,000 French and Belgians killed in the transportation plan during the run-up to D-Day. So it brings to mind the price that the French and also the Belgians eventually pay for their own liberation. And the essential dilemma of this entire operation here, which is when you are seeking to liberate a friendly country, you must risk destroying it. And that's a tough go, morally, isn't it? The Americans are going to confront the same thing in the Philippines, in the Pacific. We're going to have the same dynamic, of course, in Holland / Netherlands, Luxembourg, portions of Italy, whatever the case may be. And, of course, just when we talk about ground fighting, obviously the destruction can and will be much worse. So the transportation plan is a success. The road net on the way to Normandy is just trash. And, of course, Allied air, as Don Mueller had pointed out, and the other scholars too, Allied air had become quite supreme by D-Day, and so that gives us that kind of initiative of control over the air. Okay, so that succeeds. We'll pay the price later in the game when we're trying to advance toward Germany, when all those roads and bridges, we have to rebuild them too, but that's a problem for later. Now, how do they set up the ultimate final plan? We heard some of this, but I wanted to just sort of give you another sense of the battle area, where some of these folks are coming from here in southern England. More on that in a moment. You can see the routes they're going to take, the amphibious forces, the airborne forces, so on and so forth. A closer look. All right, so you've got a couple of British landing areas in the east. Some of you visited Sword Beach today, and of course Pegasus Bridge and all that. You can kind of see that general area. So Pegasus Bridge, here we go with our technology again. It's wonderful. It's back. Sweet. So Pegasus Bridge is that sort of eastern flank of the landing area. The British 6th Airborne is given the mission of securing that flank, obviously, to stop the Germans from rolling up the flanks of the British landing beaches there. So that means you've either got to control or destroy most any notable bridge over the Orne River or the Dives River. And that's the general mission of the 6th Airborne Division, including the famous coup de main glider landing around Pegasus Bridge. Okay, so that's inland from Sword Beach, where the British 3rd Infantry Division is going to land and proceed to advance due south, hopefully, along the Orne Canal and River and toward Caen. Now, they're obviously going to link up with the Canadians, sandwiched in the middle, but on the western side, you can see Gold Beach, the British 50th Infantry Division, is going to land there, link up with the Canadians to the east, and the Americans coming from Omaha Beach to the west. That's your general focus if you are, sort of the big picture. Now, they're augmented, of course, by quite a bit of armor, almost a division's worth of armor, plus engineers. So this is a pretty major operation, obviously, on either flank here. Sandwiched in the middle, as I mentioned, is the Canadian 3rd Division. The Canadian 3rd Division is arguably the most formidable Allied formation landing on D-Day. It's overstrength in terms of its artillery and its anti-tank pieces. They have a very ambitious mission of knifing inland, cutting that key coastal road, which many of us took today, which is a major highway, the A13, the N13 back in those days, linking up, obviously, with their British friends on either side and staving off the most powerful German armored counterattacks. They will do this mission very, very well. Their anti-tank pieces are excellent. They have armor attached to them. The Canadian 3rd Division suffers some of the highest casualty rates coming ashore at Juno Beach, of course, there in the middle. And, in terms of percentage, it's actually higher than what we suffer at Omaha Beach. So it gives you a sense what our allies are doing to the east. Of course, all that is going to be augmented, too, by British commandos and Royal Marine commandos and some French commandos, too. So notice, again, the sort of international character and the special operations side of this, too. The Americans, Omaha Beach is the most famous. What I've often called it is the nexus of the Allied invasion front. You simply have to have Omaha Beach as the connective tissue between the west flank and what the British and Canadians are doing to the east. It is very challenging terrain, as we'll see. And so the Allied planners know this, so they devote the most combat power to landing at Omaha Beach, the better part of 2 U.S. infantry divisions, the 1st and the 29th. What are we doing over there on the west? That's the extreme western flank of the invasion area, what's called Utah Beach. Why do we want the Cotentin Peninsula at all? The key is what you see up top there, Cherbourg, which is the largest and most productive harbor in Normandy at that time. And so we need the harbor in order to supply our armies. So you're eventually, ironically enough, once you're ashore at Utah Beach, you're going to be advancing away from Germany in order to get Cherbourg, oddly enough. But this is the reason for it. So if we want Cherbourg, we're going to land at Utah Beach, almost at the confluence there of the Carentan Estuary. And then you've got 2 U.S. Airborne divisions, the 82nd and the 101st, that are simply going to have to control the western approaches to Utah Beach, or we risk the possibility of annihilation for the 4th Infantry Division when they go ashore. So that's the basic overview of the plan. In between, as well, is a place called Pointe du Hoc, which Sarah had mentioned moments ago. That is obviously a kind of cliffside that juts into the ocean. The value of it for the Germans is that any artillery piece atop Pointe du Hoc, which is about 6 stories high, can rake Omaha Beach and Utah Beach with fire on either side. So Nick, of course, is going to discuss that in more depth tomorrow night, so I won't get deep into that. But that's just where it fits within the larger context of the invasion. Okay, so D-Day in numbers. All right, there we go. Gosh, I'm good with technology. All right, D-Day in numbers. You can see nearly 7,000 watercraft, and I say that purposely because, yeah, there's a few battleships, but a lot of those are landing craft of varying sizes. You can see 156,000 assault troops. We've got the plurality, but not the majority. 11,590 aircraft. And look at the ground power here. 6 amphibious divisions are going to be landed. You remember how the plan has expanded from that 3 division to ultimately a 5/6 division kind of approach. Okay, great. But that takes shipping. And so if you wonder, why is Morgan thinking like only 2 or 3 divisions? That's all the shipping he thought was available. As it turns out, of course, we're going to have more, and this is what it takes to ship just one of these divisions. 270,000 plus tons of shipping. That's over 30 ships. It's a testament to the vital importance of sea power in this entire invasion. If you don't have sea power, you don't have an invasion. Not just to land people, but to reinforce and resupply and, of course, transport. So each division requires some pretty hefty logistical and transport requirements there. So the airborne units, as you see, about 23,400 paratroopers and glider troops, both, that are part of these airborne divisions. For the United States, if we kind of take a look at this map, this is a contemporary map, a planning map that American planners were using to think about their 2 landing beaches. And you'll notice, so you can see the key players that are going to land on D-Day, the 1st and 29th Divisions at Omaha, the 4th Division at Utah. But look at the follow-on forces there, too, in which you've got, 2 armor divisions coming ashore, 2 more infantry divisions, and that's just the immediate follow-on force. Think of all the shipping you're going to need for that, all the supply, all the transportation, everything, all that infrastructure. Notice, too, I'll point out at the very top of the map, top secret, bigot. That was the word they used back then that meant you were briefed in to the top secret plan here, bigot. I dare say the U.S. Army probably wouldn't use that word now. But in World War II, it was like, okay, yes, we'll call it bigot. I have no idea why. Please don't. I have no idea. I've tried to find out. I don't know. But it's just sort of odd to modernize to see that. But it's kind of cool because it shows you some of the original intended drop zones of the 82nd Airborne, and then, just how they envision the kind of various phase lines there. So as this thing now will start to unfold, Allied soldiers are clustered in southern England. We heard the term for this last night, the sausages, which is just a marshalling area that looks like a sausage shape on a map, so that's why they call them that. So all over southern England, American soldiers are packed into these sausages waiting for the word to go. They've been trained to a fine edge for this thing by now, as you know. And so what are they doing? Well, they're passing the time with dice games, card games, bull sessions, movies, sports, to blow off steam, impromptu baseball and softball games, football games, anything you can do to just sort of blow off steam and get your mind off what's going on. Or final preparations. Gee, I think I'll clean my rifle for the 50th time, and maybe it'll be cleaner this time, I'll look and make sure my machine gun is oiled properly, or, just anything like that. Or I'll study the plan again. You know how that is when you're sort of over-prepared. I think that's sort of the mood here for many of them. The food is really good, which immediately gets a lot of these cynical combat soldiers' attention. Like, why is the food so good? So there's all these sort of fattening us up for the kill jokes, inevitably. This is Lieutenant Edward Jones, a recon soldier with the 29th Division, scheduled to go ashore early at Omaha Beach. The food was just the very best. The finest any of us had eaten since we left the U.S. White bread, ice cream, steaks, chicken. Sounds like our food here, it's really good stuff. And so they're like, do they expect we won't be around anymore? It's like the last meal or something, but, you're glad to get it. There's enormous tension, and sometimes just this led to fights. Hard to imagine among young soldiers fighting, just blowing off steam, and just weird stuff that was happening. So give you a little example, and I really want to give you the sense of like the soldier's experience here. So there was a regimental commander named Colonel Russell Red Reeder, who had really almost become kind of a legend in the Army by now. And he was scheduled to command the 12th Infantry Regiment, which was like the second wave regiment for the 4th Division at Utah Beach. And so he's got his guys all primed and everything, and got everybody ready to go, and they're in their sausage, and all of a sudden a psychiatrist shows up from out of nowhere and wants to examine every single guy who's slated to go in on the invasion. And Reeder's like, why? Oh, we want to make sure they're suitable for this thing. And like, now? And so he examines every single person. He's like, yes. And then there's one guy he picks out and says, that guy's a psychopath. I don't think you should go. And Reeder's like, really? At this stage, we're going to do this? And so he went to the guy's commander and said, what do you think? And he said, he's fine. So just a weird situation like that, where Reeder then had to go to his division commander, Major General Raymond Barton, to get this individual soldier to go in on Operation Overlord. Whether he demonstrated psychopathic tendencies subsequently, I don't know. But I think it was all good at this stage. So no one, as you might imagine, was allowed in or out of the sausages because of security. You want to keep the Germans in the dark, obviously, especially after these guys have been briefed. You don't want them out circulating. So these are young soldiers, though. They see the world differently than we old people all these years later, of sort of rationality of let's keep operational security here. They're like, well, we don't have anything to do right now, so wouldn't it be nice to get out of here and go get a drink or go find some women or something? Yes, let's do that. So there's these two paratroopers in 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, Dwayne Burns and a buddy of his. This sounds really good to them, and somehow they duck under the wire. And they're just walking aimlessly toward the nearest town and hoping to find a pub where there could be women. And that's the plan, basically. That's as near as I can tell. And then this command car drives up, or a Jeep, excuse me, and in it is the Assistant Division Commander, Brigadier General James Gavin, and he asks him, what are you guys doing out here? And so it was one of these interesting leadership moments when Gavin just could have completely roasted these guys, and instead he kind of understands what they're doing, but he's like, what are you guys doing out here? Asking them. They come up with this cock and bull story, and then he's like, do me a favor, go back to your captain and tell him no one's allowed out of the marshalling area, and they're only too eager to comply rather than get in trouble at this point. And so I think he really handled that beautifully without dressing these guys down who might be facing death, within 24, 48 hours. So just one of those weird things. There's another one where the leadership is a little bit different because this guy is more of a hardcore dude. Captain Charles Murphy is a company commander, 1st Engineer Combat Battalion, 1st Infantry Division. And he has decided that he and his radio group are going to go in with some of the initial waves at Omaha Beach in order to set up and liaison with the infantry units. And so he finds out that 2 of his senior sergeants had deliberately left their sausage in order to go to a local pub and hook up with their British girlfriends. So their plan was a lot more elaborate. They were going to use the phone and hook up with him. And so he busts these guys down to private and said, you just signed your death warrant because I'm using you as a runner. And indeed, one of them was killed at Omaha Beach. So that situation, had a kind of tragic ending. There were people who had premonitions too. I want to give you a sense of that. So this is Private Johnny Dahm. Johnny Dahm was in the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, and when they're in their marshalling area, he's just totally morose. And this happened with some people that seemed to have premonitions of death. And so one of his buddies, Ed Boca-Fogley, comes to him and says, "What's wrong?" And Dahm tells him, he's like, "I'm going to die tomorrow." And so Ed's trying to talk him out of it. He's like, "No, you won't. You're going to be okay." Well, unfortunately, Dahm was right about the outcome, if not the timing. He did not die on D-Day, but he died on June 8th. So there were weird situations like that where people had premonitions that ended up being right. But there were many other times, too, I should point out, where people had premonitions that were actually wrong. Where people didn't have premonitions and they died. But it was just part of the emotion of the moment. So no one's more nervous, of course, than the Supreme Commander in the middle there, Dwight Eisenhower. And there was no question that you would have an American commander for Overlord, of course, because of U.S. leadership that I mentioned. So he picked June 5th as the invasion date, and as the fateful day approaches, obviously, famously, a storm intrudes on his plan. He has to postpone it for a day. So he's got all these burdens about the weather, about the outcome of this thing, and in addition, he's been sort of on the recipient of a kind of last-minute warning by his air commander, Trafford Lee Mallory, who is right there. Whoops. Where are you, Lee Mallory? There you go, right there. That's his air commander coming to him, desperately urging Eisenhower to call off the U.S. Airborne draft because he thinks there's going to be terrible prohibitive casualties among some of the elite troops in the U.S. forces. He says it's going to be a disaster. Please do this. And he's like, I want it on the written record that I oppose this. So imagine if you're like your key air commander comes to you with this, that will give you pause. So this adds to Eisenhower's stress, as you might imagine. He goes to General Omar Bradley, who you also see there as the ranking American ground commander. He goes to the 2 division commanders, Maxwell Taylor, who commands the 101st, Matthew Ridgway commands the 82nd, and they're unanimous. They say, we simply have to have these drops if Utah Beach is to be viable. So Ike has to make that call then, doesn't he, of whether to go ahead with this, and he doesn't know how it'll turn out. That's been a theme we've talked about, right? We know how it turned out. They don't, one of the things that factors into Eisenhower's decision is not just how important these drops were going to be, but the fact that Lee Mallory had a reputation as an alarmist. So personal discourse comes into it a little bit as well. He gives the call, of course, to go ahead with it. The ships are underway, airfields all over the place, paratroopers ramping up, glider people, so on and so forth, troops packed aboard ships. Well, Eisenhower, of course, is famously then going to visit the troops. He goes to Greenham Common, where the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment is based, and he moves among the soldiers, famously, chatting and grinning, the famous Eisenhower grin, So he's ostensibly there to buck up their morale, but it's kind of the opposite. Oops. Yeah. So he's talking there to Lieutenant Wallace Strobel. My mic's going. And it looks like he's making some serious military point, whatnot. By the testimony of Strobel, they weren't talking about anything remotely related to Operation Overlord. They're talking about fishing, fly fishing. And so Ike is talking about casting a rod. See what he's doing? And because Strobel came from Michigan, and that reminded of Eisenhower, who loved to fish, that he'd once gone fishing in Michigan or something, and so they got talking fishing. So it was sort of like that, just kind of informal, get to know people, be seen, and that kind of thing. So at one other airfield where Ike didn't visit, this guy, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Wolverton, the commander of 3rd Battalion, 506 Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne, makes this, I think, really incredibly moving farewell address to his troops. So they gathered in an orchard, and they sat and they listened solemnly to their colonel, a man they loved like a father. So this is before they were about to board their aircraft. And Wolverton asked them to kneel and pray with them. Instead of looking down, he asked them to look up as if they were addressing God directly. And he said, God Almighty, in a few short hours, will be in battle with the enemy. We don't ask favors or indulgence. Use us as instruments for the right and an aid to returning peace to the world. We only ask this. If we must die, we die as men would die, without complaining, without pleading, safe in the feeling we've done our best for what we believed is right. And it just ends there. And there's this kind of silence among these soldiers. And while it all sinks in, and they all stand up as one, and they move to the aircraft. And in the reflection of Sergeant Robert Webb, who was part of this, he said it was without a dry eye in the whole 760 men. These are tough dudes. These are paratroopers. And yet that's the emotion of the moment, He said, another trooper said, as he knelt and prayed, Wolverton could not have been more trusted and loved by the men in his battalion had he been the father of each one. I believe any of us would have followed him through hell. Well, unfortunately, they were about to do so. Wolverton was killed in action instantly in his harness before his feet could ever touch French soil. He was hung up in a tree. His unit landed right on top of a German troop concentration, and really is one of the most disastrous landings in all the airborne drops. It's near Saint-Côme-du-Mont. So those airborne drops, how's it looking in terms of the larger picture? Well, busy map, but just by way of explanation, you can see the 2 U.S. airborne divisions where they land, but the little green dots represent a stick. An airborne stick is basically a plane load. Okay, so that's about 16 to 18 paratroopers who are going to be dropped. And you can see some of them are scattered, much different places than where they're supposed to land. You can see the proximity to Utah Beach, of course. So just as a basic overview, the 82nd Airborne Division is to land to the west here and secure that entire western flank and any kind of bridge or structure over the Méditerranée River so that we can advance west, cut off the Cotentin Peninsula, and then go up and get Cherbourg. The 101st Airborne Division is to the east, landing just behind Utah Beach to capture the key causeways. There's 4 key causeways at Utah Beach. They're going to capture them from the western side so they can link up with the 4th Division coming ashore. They're also going to take out German troop concentrations and some of they capture some of the key bridges that are sort of down here as we get nearer to Carentan. Okay, so those are the basic missions of the 2 divisions, and of course you can see how they're scattered. Why are they scattered? Well, as the transport aircraft are moving west to east across the peninsula, they run into a lot of cloud cover. The weather, as you know, hadn't been that great the previous day. You've got a hole in the storm system, about 36 hours. A lot of fog, a lot of cloud cover, so it reduces visibility. But the bigger reason is German anti-aircraft opposition. The Army Air Forces had kind of oversold the idea that those flak batteries and whatever kind of anti-aircraft that could be there was just going to be gone or suppressed. Actually, this wasn't true. So you are basically flying into heavy fire. You've got basically a flying gas can with no self-sealing fuel tanks. You have no armaments. You have very little armor of any kind. You've got a thin skin to this plane, and you've got paratroopers packed aboard, plus also weaponry, explosives, all this kind of stuff. Are you going to fly straight into the anti-aircraft fire? Is that wise? No. And so the narrative of this whole thing is sort of controlled by the paratroopers for the first 30, 40, 50 years after the war. Wow, these transport pilots really screwed up. They took evasive maneuvers, dropped us everywhere, all these, and of course, yes, there's some truth to that, but why it happens. So what you're being asked to do as a transport pilot is the aviation equivalent of charging straight into the muzzle of a machine gun. If you do that, you're probably going to get shot down, and your paratroopers are just as dead. Okay, so they do the least bad option, which is to start to jink and move around and take evasive maneuvers and drop their paratroopers where they can. So some of the drops are really scattered badly. Some people are dropped in the ocean, a very few. Some are dropped miles away. Some are dropped pretty well. It's a mixture, okay, but it's extremely chaotic. As one paratrooper remembered the experience of being shot at so accurately, he said it sounded like someone threw a keg of nails against the side of the airplane. And that's what it sounded like to him as he hurled himself out the door. So all over the Khotan 10, these troopers and the glider troops who are going to follow fight in small clusters, accomplishing their missions as best they can. And as you kind of sense, you can see a town called Saint-Mary-Église, and this is a closer look at it right there, where I know some of you have been. That really is a key objective. And the reason is it's a crossroads town. And any German wanting to get to Utah Beach simply has to get to Saint-Mary-Église. Okay, so Saint-Mary-Église is going to be the location of one of the more accurate drops on D-Day, the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, which is largely to the northeast, but not all of them. Some of them are dropped in the town itself, which was not in the plan. One example I'll give you is a young paratrooper in the 505th, 17 years old, named Ken Russell. Ken Russell is an interesting case. He had left high school early to join the Army underage, and he had done it, so he would say in later years, with the idea of participating in the invasion of France. So here he is getting his wish and wondering if that was a good idea, as he's on this plane watching all this anti-aircraft fire coming up. But he's standing there, and you know what thought comes to his mind? He's like, you know what? Right now, back in Knoxville, Tennessee area where he was from, my high school class is graduating. And if you think about it, it's June 6th. That's when graduation is probably going to happen in those days. And the time difference, he's about right. So that's what goes through his mind. Then when he goes out the door, he certainly sees the anti-aircraft fire, all the tracer rounds and all that. And then over Saint-Mary-Église, he notices a building that's on fire. The location of the Airborne Museum today had a building at that point in time that had been probably put on fire by a tracer round coming down. We're not really 100% sure. But he sees that, and he's near, and he thinks, oh, Lord, they're jumping us into hell. And he wasn't far wrong, because one of his buddies is hit, like a direct hit, and he had been carrying explosives, so he just atomizes. I think probably two of them, nearest we can tell, descend into the burning building. So Russell sees all this. He ends up snagged on the lower part of the Saint-Mary-Église church. So John Steele is the more famous person, supposedly up top on the steeple. And I won't wade into that swamp because many historians think that didn't happen, so I won't go into that. We can talk about that individually if you want to. But Russell is in the lower part, okay? So he and others are just sort of fighting to capture this town. And Saint-Mary-Église, of course, is one of the first towns liberated in Normandy. But the Germans want it back, so what this map shows you is German counterattacks coming from both north and south, and the 82nd Airborne Division holding them off on either side. Okay, so that, of course, is absolutely vital to the viability of Utah Beach. So all this is happening in the hours before the 4th Division hits Utah Beach and thereafter as well. So for the next day or so. And there are many notable people who are fighting. A guy named Turner Turnbull, who was actually a Native American, a lieutenant leading a platoon at Neuville-la-Plaine, which you see about a mile north of Saint-Mary-Église, a delaying action, which is almost legendary now. He is killed in action the day after that happens. It's the Sergeant Robert Nyland, who will eventually, along with his brothers, become the inspiration for writer Robert Rodat to write this obscure script called Saving Private Ryan. Maybe you've heard of it. He is killed in action in that fight around Neuville-la-Plaine. So how does this then impact the ultimate landings at Utah Beach? So here's a overview look at Utah Beach, and give you a sense of how they're preparing for this on D-Day itself. You've got a major pre-invasion bombardment, and it consists of pounding from warships, of course, but I would argue in terms of effectiveness, low-level strikes from medium bombers, and I'm talking lower than 10,000 feet. So, of course, we visited the East Anglia with the heavy bomb group airfields and all that. These are the medium bomber guys, probably, I think, from the 9th Air Force here. And so their job is to come in low and fairly slow over the landing beaches and bomb with some level of accuracy. They deal with plenty of opposition, anti-aircraft, as you might imagine. They're trying to hit the famous, coastal fortifications that we associate with the Normandy invasion, the bunkers, the pillboxes, all that. We went through the heaviest concentration of anti-aircraft fire I had yet seen. Lieutenant Alan Stevens of the 397th Bomb Group said tracers and flak explosions were so thick that it looked impossible to get through without being hit. Well, in spite of that, these aviators unleashed a torrent of devastating bombs. So this is a diary entry from another aviator that he wrote after he came back from his mission. He said, "The bombs carpeting the target are bursting like bubbles in a vat of nitric acid. There are spouts of flame and belching smoke, which seem to leap at us like some angry monster writhing horribly. It's terrible in its sheer destruction." And he's exactly right. I mean, this is really accurate bombing by World War II standards. It's about a 25 to 35% accuracy rate in hitting their targets. It degrades what's already a fairly weak point in the German coastal defenses, manned by some troops who are basically Eastern European roster filler because the Germans are having manpower problems. And I think you've heard this, that some of these guys get the option. Well, we can work you to death as slave labor, or you can serve in the German armed forces. What's your pick? What would you choose? So some of these guys are here fighting under duress and under coercion. If they're nailed by these medium bombers, you can imagine their enthusiasm for fighting will diminish. So finally, it's time for the amphibious troops of the 8th Infantry Regiment, 4th Division, who are the leading troops, to hit the beach. So they're seasick, they're wet, they're nervous, they're riding on their landing craft, packed in like lemmings, like you can envision. Many of these craft have been circling for hours by the time H hour at 6:30 comes along. And so the biggest problem they've got as they come ashore generally is mines. The minesweepers have done a remarkable job leading the way for an entire Allied fleet to get to the Normandy coast. But it's a quick job. They haven't been able to secure all of it and to get rid of all the mines. So there are still some here that are in play as we're moving towards Utah Beach. So this has consequences. So several ships struck mines, creating a lot of confusion. A sergeant named Carl Rambo, that really was his name, Rambo, well before Sylvester Stallone had even heard of the name or been alive, was a tank commander, and he saw one landing craft tank, or LCT, hit a mine, and this is what he remembered. "I saw tanks blown 50 to 100 feet in the air. They tumbled as if they were flipped matchboxes. The LCT was broken in two." Added to that, of course, the German artillery and machine gun fire. Of course, the naval bombardment has happened too, but not quite as effective as the aerial bombardment. And so the tides are sort of pulling you south. And so what happens is instead of landing up here at this spot in Les Dunes de Varaville, we're going to land out here about a mile to the south at La Madeleine. Okay, so this is actually a softer spot in the German defenses, so this is kind of lucky on some levels. So what's your biggest peril as you come ashore? Artillery fire, more so than like immediate opposition right in front of you, though there is that. So the troops struggle off their landing craft. They wade in. They take shelter among a concrete seawall. So you've got a kind of a flat beach at what is a sort of low tide, and then it leads to this kind of seawall built into these sandy dunes. And then beyond that, you've got sort of marshlands. And then on either side of those four causeways I alluded to, as the map shows you, there's flooded land. Okay, which tells you vehicles can't use that. Infantry can move across that 3-4 foot high flooded land quite uncomfortably, but vehicles cannot, hence the importance of the causeways. So as you're coming ashore, you're confronting that seawall, and then whatever defenses they got in front of you, and you're worried about the artillery fire. So they struggle off the landing craft. They try to wade in. In the great American tradition, they're weighed down with way too much stuff. About 80 pounds, 85 pounds of stuff per man. Fred Crum was one of these guys. He said, "We moved as quickly as the weight we carried permitted. Each step seemed as though a ball and chain had been tied to our ankles." Because they're wet, too, and they're nervous, and in some cases still seasick. We waded through 3 feet of water, charged through a house, firing through the door. We heard shouts. One of our soldiers kicked in the door so I could throw a grenade inside. 10 to 15 Germans came out with their hands up to become prisoners. The guy named Bill Conrad. Now, they may or may not have been Germans. Many of the guys who were defending that beach were actually Georgians, not from the state, but from the country. And did they want to be there? Of course not. So you do have another instance where a flamethrower team will literally roast some of these guys out of a pillbox. Absolutely gruesome. You see that at Utah Beach. There's not really any substantial conclusive evidence to show that actually occurred at Omaha Beach, the use of flamethrowers against bunkers. So the landings are going well, but there's a real problem. We've landed in the wrong spot. Okay, so what that means is we're basically funnelized in the one causeway we control, exit 2, which you see right in the heart of the landing area. You need the other 2 ones to the north, exit 3 and 4, for all the follow-on force that are coming in, because you remember, more regiments, more vehicles, more engineers, all the tanks, whatever. Okay, so what do you do with the follow-on waves? Well, that decision rests upon the shoulders of this guy, Brigadier General Ted Roosevelt. Yes, he's the son of the president by the same name. Ted Roosevelt had just an amazing life story that, again, I could give a whole talk on just that, so I'm only going to give you the highlight. Ted Roosevelt had served in World War I as a very courageous officer, had been badly wounded in the leg, and you can see how he's got a cane there. So he's in his 50s here, by World War II, so he's walking with a cane. He had founded the American Legion in the interwar period. He had served as Governor General to the Philippines. He was just a major player. But in this war, he had served as a second in command of the Big Red One, the 1st Infantry Division in the Mediterranean. He'd been cycled out of that job because they thought there were discipline problems in the Big Red One, but he's a great commander, a great officer, and the soldiers loved him. So there's no way he's going home. So he's attached here as a kind of supernumerary 1-star general. He's not the second in command of the 4th Division. The commander is Major General Raymond Barton, but he persuades Barton to let him go in with the assault troops on the theory that if you see this broken down old man here, that these young soldiers are going to think, well, I guess this isn't so bad, and indeed, many times throughout the day, soldiers are offering to help him along and everything, and he almost like whacks him with his cane, like, get away from me, sonny, I'm fine, that kind of dynamic. And so he's got to decide, what do we do with the follow-on? And you think, well, it's obvious, you just land right where you are. But the downside of that, as I said, you've only got one causeway, so you might funnelize everything that's coming in ashore at Utah Beach and really get bogged down. And all that artillery fire that's coming in from farther up the coast could be a real problem. Or do you go back to the original plan and say, nope, we're going to pivot away from here, go back to land to the north, a mile to the north, seize those 2 causeways? What do we do? Well, he decides, you know what, we got an advantage over the Germans right now. Let's exploit it, and then we'll advance farther to the south and get this the causeway number 1, and we'll have 2 causeways, and then we'll develop the situation from there. And this turns out to be the right call. He famously says, we'll start the war from right here. He's aided, by the way, by another remarkable military personality, James Van Fleet, who commands the 8th Infantry Regiment at that point, very successfully, will one day retire as a 4-star general, and it just has an incredible combat career. So by midday, the 4th Division had linked up with paratroopers at a town called Poopaville. The GIs inevitably called it Poopville. Wasn't that obvious? That was going to happen. So they do, and they link up. One of the paratroopers is so excited to see the 4th Division and its accompanying armor that he kisses the front of a tank. They get within about a mile or so of San Mariglis, and then they're going to get there the next day. So you land 1,700 vehicles, 20,000 troops. The Americans suffer 197 casualties at Utah Beach. It's not a walkover. It's very dangerous, mainly from the artillery fire, and it's going to become more so in the days that follow because of all that entrenched German artillery up the coastline there. Well, obviously, as we all know, the tougher nut to crack is here at Omaha Beach, where many of us are going tomorrow. Omaha Beach is about a 4.5-mile stretch of Norman coast on the Calvados coast. And everybody knows it's going to be the toughest spot for two reasons: the terrain and the opposition. The terrain is really challenging because you're bracketed on either side, as you can kind of see on the map here, by cliffs. And as I'll show you in a moment, there's a crescent shape to Omaha Beach. Significance of that, it allows your enemy to be on either flank, giving you devastating fire, what's called enfilade fire. And of course, it's a rocky, shingle and seawall strewn beach with no organic roads at all that you're going to have engineers build, and it's going to be tough to get off that beach because there's so much high ground brooding over it. Only way off that beach is in the sort of natural defiles that you've got here that nature has created, these ravines and gullies that we generally call beach exits or draws. You'll hear those terms applied to them. And then the engineers are going to have to build roads in those places if we capture them. Otherwise, you're going to be kind of barrelized on that beach. In other words, stuck down there with the tides coming in, the Germans looking over you and firing down. So the second component of that, components of the 352nd Infantry Division are going to move towards Omaha Beach as of March 1944. This is no surprise. The French resistance has told Allied intelligence this, but here we have a little bit of a disconnect with the word getting to the people who actually need it, the guys going ashore. The division commander of the 1st Division, Major General Clarence Hubner, is told, like, on D-Day morning, he's like, well, what do you want us to do? So regardless, it has to be taken. But I think there's a sort of mythology that there's a whole German division there and this sort of massive German presence. Fortunately, that's not true. There's probably about 1,200 Germans over the whole expanse of Omaha Beach, but the defenses are so formidable, the terrain so formidable that obviously, little that goes a long way. They're very, very tough in that kind of situation. So Omar Bradley had invested a lot of hope that the heavy bombers, of the 8th Air Force could degrade the Omaha Beach defenses. This doesn't happen, and in my opinion, you're just asking them to do something they can't do. Bomb within about a 1,000-yard window through heavy cloud cover, mind you, in front of a friendly fleet? I mean, I don't care if you're the greatest bombardier in the history of aviation. That's a great challenge. So with the technology at the time, this is just too big of an ask. So most of their bombs land inland, quite ineffectually, of course. They're kind of just miscast, whereas the medium bombers are better cast for the Utah Beach aerial bombardment, I would argue at least. The naval bombardment lasts for only about 45 minutes. Why? Because we want the element of surprise, which makes total sense. Okay? So, yes, you don't want the Germans to be tipped off the day before of a long bombardment or whatever. But 45 minutes is not going to get you that much. So the naval bombardment is not particularly effective. But later on, when the Navy can pinpoint targets in the course of the day, then they'll be way more effective. At this point, not as much. So we got a lot of smoke and dust. You've got the fog. You've got some drizzle. You've got spray. It's very confusing, as to the visibility is really bad. And then you can kind of see, if we're looking here, this is from what's called WN60, where many of us will go tomorrow. That's like the easternmost strong point of all of Omaha Beach. And you're looking all the way at the expanse of it. Up here is Point de la Percée, which brackets the western side of Omaha Beach. In between, you can see that crescent shape. I'll point out that there was no parking lot in 1944, so I'll say that. But the fields of fire are different, too. There have been a lot less foliage in 1944. The Germans wanted a kind of open beach in order to shoot down on it. But it does give you a sense of the beach and what it looks like and the kind of challenge you've got in front of you. So, naval bombardment ineffective. Aerial bombardment ineffective. Tides are pulling you generally to the eastward. Visibility's bad. You can kind of see where I'm going with this. The Omaha Beach plan is designed as a combined arms plan to present the Germans with way too many targets to overwhelm them with the teamwork of what you've got in front of you. What I mean is you got anti-aircraft units that are going to land, either with vehicles or dismounted anti-aircraft pieces, fire at those pillboxes that are all so famous there. Pin them down. Tanks are supposed to come in and do something of the same thing. Famously, amphibiously, like swimming tanks, but many times also just aboard landing craft and brought ashore that way. So they'll be a supporting mission. 1 out of every 4 soldiers that goes ashore at Omaha Beach on D-Day is an engineer. Why? Because the Germans had fortified this place so heavily with obstacles and mines in order to obviously pin us down on the beach. So you've got to deal with that. And there was a lot of concern in Allied Command, I Command, leading up to D-Day about how you were going to create holes through the German obstacle belt. So the solution for that were what was called gap assault teams, joint Army-Navy engineer teams that are going to go in at H-hour and try and blow passageways through the obstacle belt, okay? So the Navy's going to get everything underwater, the Army, everything that you can see on land. That's the plan. So they're the engineers at H-hour, and then, of course, the infantry, I would argue, this is my bias, the stars of the show, always, they have, of course, the deadliest and toughest job, seize the beach, get off the beach, move inland, clear the way for everybody else, and go beyond, okay? So all this is supposed to happen, kind of overwhelming, landing in those dead spots in the German defenses, and just overwhelm them as you flank around them and you destroy them and pin them down. Instead, and this is why Omaha Beach in that first hour and a half to 2 hours is so deadly, instead the pattern is they're going to be landing in dribs and drabs. Piecemeal, behind schedule, off target, like maybe a half mile to the wrong direction. And the tendency is that they're going to land right under the snouts of the strongest German defenses. This is what famously happens at the Vierville Draw, portrayed in Saving Private Ryan. This is what happens at the Colville Draw, which is the 1st Infantry Division sector to the east. And so that means you've entered a kill zone. And there's not that much you can do about it. So this is why Omaha Beach at that point is so incredibly deadly. You've also got support troops landing, too, that are mixed up in all this, too. Obviously, a lot of medics. All these units have medics. You have the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion. Their job is to hook up barrage balloons to ships in order to protect them from strafing enemy planes. This is an African-American unit that's going to land in the course of the morning. And there's one guy I point out, I mentioned medics a minute ago. Corporal Waverly Woodson is a medic there. He has this impromptu aid station. He treats dozens of casualties in the course of the day. He performs an amputation on his own, and he saves who knows how many lives. There are many trying to get him the Medal of Honor. That whole situation is pending. So there's a fairly diverse force coming ashore at Omaha Beach. There's some African-American quartermasters, too, who are in the mix of this whole mess. But, of course, the combat soldiers are largely white. But no one cared your color at Omaha Beach. The Germans were killing everybody they could, So you've got this really difficult situation here. On top of it, you don't have as many tanks ashore as is the plan. Because 27 out of 32 of the duplex driver amphibious tanks in the Big Red 1 sector sink in the waters, and with an average loss of 1 crewman per tank. Some of those tanks are still there beneath the waves today. The majority of the tanks get ashore. Those that do tremendous damage. But the dilemma you've got as a tanker at Omaha Beach is people are taking cover, strewn around. The gap assault teams can't do their jobs because infantry are taking cover behind the obstacles. That seems to be the only way to survive. And so as a tanker, you're like, well, is that, I got a limited vision slot. Is that guy dead? Is he wounded? I don't want to run over him regardless, but I got to keep moving because the tides are coming in. And if I don't keep moving, German anti-tank fire is going to hit my tank. So that's the dilemma you've got. If you're an infantryman, you can imagine the firepower you're up against. If you're an engineer, the gap assault teams take about 50% casualties. It's just horrifying. This is gruesome, but this is what happened. Give you a couple examples of what happens in these kill zones. Lieutenant Aaron Denstedt, a really interesting guy. He had gone to UCLA. He had not graduated yet. He was too young. He'd gone to UCLA, left to join the Army, and had come to his platoon as a new platoon leader before D-Day. Very humble and was loved by his men. Most new platoon leaders are not. And he is, because of his self-effacing, moderate personality, they felt like they would follow him to anywhere. When they get off the landing craft, he and his sergeant decide to go in different directions to flank around to lead their men. His sergeant survives. Denstedt takes a bullet to the head and is killed instantly. His mother wrote a really poignant letter to an Army historian not long after that, urging her urging the Army to tell his story. And she said, I'm just the heartbroken mother of a son that I'll never see again. Please tell his story. You see that as in a story, and you're like, yeah, I think I'm going to tell that story. Norman Speckler was a private who was, like many of them, carrying heavy explosives in order to blow holes through what were called barbed wire, or with Bangalore torpedoes. You've heard a lot about that, I'm sure. And he takes a direct hit, and he's just, unfortunately, just blown to pieces. It's all over his buddies, So this is what you're dealing with at Omaha Beach. So the look of it is like this. This is the Big Red one side, where there's like a shingle bank. It's like a raised embankment of rocks. They're smooth, polished, and, of course, the footing is tough. On the 29th Division side, you've got a seawall, okay? So it seems like there's an illusion of cover here, but look how many people are sort of taking cover at the shingle bank. You may be safe from machine gun fire and German small arms, but I would argue the most potent weapon the Germans have at Omaha Beach is the inland artillery, which is just raking it over. So imagine the multiplication of the fragmentation effect you're going to have here, and mortar fire and all that. So you're really not safe. But this is sort of what it looks like at that point during sometime in the morning on June 6th. So how do we get off the beach? How do we deal with this? I'll give you a few brief examples, but I want to also mention, for everyone I'm talking about here, there could be a dozen others whose actions we don't know and are lost to history, okay? So these are just representative examples, but we know significant examples of why things turn out as they do. The second guy from the right there is Lieutenant John Spaulding, okay? So Spaulding was a brand new platoon leader on D-Day, and he was not young, though. He was 29, maybe even 30, and this is his first combat. He's taking over a boat section of 32 guys, including him, and many of them have seen combat in the Mediterranean theater, because the Big Red One is a heavily combat experienced unit. About half the guys who replace him, about half have seen combat. He was a sports writer in civilian life back in Owensboro, Kentucky, wife and baby back home. So the leadership dynamic is really interesting. He's in charge, he's responsible, but the guy who really has the most sway is this guy, Tech Sergeant Phil Stresik, who's a heavily combat experienced NCO, who is quite decorated for valor from fighting in the Mediterranean, in North Africa, and in Sicily. Stresik was part of a big Polish-American family from New Jersey, and he'd had to leave school after the 8th grade during the Depression in order to help support his family, and he's drafted, and he finds out that he's like a natural soldier. If you'd taken a poll in the 1st Division before D-Day as to, like, who's the most courageous soldier in the division, he would have had a lot of votes. So imagine you're Stresik, here's this new guy running things. So these two have to figure out how they're going to operate this platoon once they get ashore. Now they land, they're the one boat section of A Company 16th Infantry that lands in the right spot, in a dead spot on the German defenses. Now this allows them to kind of work their way up the bluffs in that dead spot, dealing with mines and barbed wire and ultimately some German machine gun posts, but it's weak enough that the Spaulding-Stresik section is able to kind of move inland and then start to kind of gravitate westward to give you a sense of which direction. See where it says WN64. Okay, so they've landed like half smack in the middle between WN62 and 64 there. And they move towards WN64, and in the course of the day, they just attack it and degrade it. Significance. If you're coming in on a follow-on wave at what's called the Easy Red Sector, which you see there at the map, it means it's safer for you because Spaulding and Stresik are keeping the Germans busy there. Okay? They're like knives in the vitals probing around at the Germans at that point. Okay? And, of course, they lose 2 killed, 7 wounded. There are 7 Distinguished Service Crosses given to soldiers in that boat section out of 32, including Spaulding and Stresik. Both of them survive D-Day and the war, by the way. So just one example. The next is this guy who's near and dear to my heart, and I think some of yours, if you've heard of him, Lieutenant Jimmy Monteith, who's a platoon leader in L Company 16th Infantry. So he lands at the extreme, like, eastern part of Omaha Beach under that cliff. And this guy, he's just so interesting because he had once attended Virginia Tech, and his family had a tradition of attending Virginia Tech. And his father, his brother, but he wasn't much of a student. And he wasn't that serious of a student, and he kind of flunks out, and he felt terrible about it, and like, oh man, I've let my family down. He finds a little more purpose in the army, and he finds a real strength of character, which had shown in the Battle of Sicily, a bravery, and he had a great deal of respect among his troops. So Jimmy Monteith is his contribution to D-Day. What he pulls off is still really kind of mystifying for us historians all these years later. At that extreme eastern end, he's able to help move 2 Sherman tanks off the beach over what appears to us to be like this inaccessible escarpment today, but perhaps had a kind of ramping effect back then. He's able to do this under fire, point them in the direction toward WN60, which you all saw on the map a moment ago, and really nail portions of WN60, and then help sort of have this kind of advanced movement all the way up that western flank, sort of like where we'll have the hike tomorrow, roughly along that route. In the course of the day, as he helps stave off a German counterattack, he's killed in action. He, of course, will get the Medal of Honor, and he remains a kind of a legend to this day. He says at one point during D-Day to his platoon sergeant, with whom he was very close, completely different dynamic than Spaulding and Striesek. He says, one thing is for sure, this ain't our day. You know, I think that was true and not true, on some levels, but I just think that's such an interesting statement. To wrap it up, the sort of last significant personality I'll mention here. The guy who commands them all, Colonel George Taylor, is the commander of the 16th Infantry Regiment, which, of course, is the leading assault regiment of the 1st Division. Taylor's 45 years old at this point. You can see him a little later when he's promoted to Brigadier General, but notice the big red one patch he's got, his combat infantry badge and all that. Taylor was really one of the Army's leading experts on amphibious operations. And he is going to come ashore about an hour and a half after H hour. His advance HQ had come ashore at H hour, and his executive officer, Lieutenant Colonel Huey Matthews, had been killed instantly. He's the highest-ranking American soldier killed at Omaha Beach, and he's buried, by the way, at the cemetery where we will be going for the commemoration. So Taylor comes in and he sees this chaos that we've discussed tonight, and he's obsessed with the notion of the dead and those about to die. Only 2 kinds of people are going to be on this beach: the dead and those who are going to die. So get off the beach. Really, unfortunately, and of course, this is why no one likes to see movies with historians. In The Longest Day, Robert Mitchum's character, Brigadier General Dutch Coda, says those words, and I just think that's so unfortunate. It's no aspersion on Coda. He probably deserves the Medal of Honor for what he did on the 29th Division side, but he didn't say those words. In fact, one of the things I found out is that Taylor was obsessed with that concept well before D-Day. He'd written them about it the previous fall. He had said, in a landing operation, there are 2 classes of men that may be found on a beach: those who are already dead and those who are about to die. And so when he comes ashore, he's just constantly moving up and down the beach, saying, only 2 kinds of people, dead and about to die, get off the beach, get moving. And he's doing this under extreme fire. I found just dozens and dozens and dozens of accounts of people who remembered it directly. Eyewitness remembered seeing him and thought, what is this crazy old guy doing? Does he really think we're going to face this fire? And, that's a classic combat situation there. So Taylor's contributions are twofold. He saves a lot of lives by motivating men to get off the beach where they're essentially vulnerable and helpless. Basically, when you're on Omaha Beach, you're a target. When you're moving off the beach as an American soldier, you're probably a hunter. And so you'd rather be the second. And it may be hard to do. And on that danger, you think, okay, well, maybe I can take cover here and it'll be okay. I don't know what to do next. But here's someone telling you what to do. And that kind of animates you. So there's that kind of dynamic to it. The second contribution is by channeling so many men off those narrow paths, by motivating them to start to move inland, he provides vital reinforcements to some of those first guys off the beach, like Spaulding, Striesek, Monteith, and others whom I haven't mentioned, so that they're not hung out to dry with the Germans able to cut them off. So his contributions are massive. He's one of the reasons why we succeed at Omaha Beach. He gets a Distinguished Service Cross and, as you see, a promotion. I want to also mention, too, the U.S. Navy destroyers come in close to the beach and provide vital fire support in the course of the day once they can kind of spot targets in the course of this violent battle. USS Carmack, Harding, and Frankfurt, to just name a few, really saved a lot of lives that day. So the naval fire is effective just under these different circumstances in the pre-invasion bombardment. So by early afternoon, your situation looks like this. You've got follow-on force from the 18th Infantry, the 115th that are going to land. Omaha Beach is still a really dangerous place to be, but you're not going to get pushed into the sea. You're not going to lose. You've cracked the hard shell of German resistance. What did it cost? Well, about 35,000 troops are landed in the course of the day and the night. What's the casualties? Probably about 2,500 to 3,000. So it's the most casualty-ridden portion of the Normandy invasion for the Allies. And what I meant by the Canadians, it's the highest percentage of casualties, not sheer numbers. Here, obviously, it's sheer numbers. But we're landing a lot more people. Overall, the Allies suffer about 10,000 casualties in the course of D-Day alone. That includes 4,426 deaths. How many of those are American? 2,509. Why do we know this with any precision? The National D-Day Memorial in Bedford, Virginia, which I highly encourage all of you to visit. It's incredible. They've done what's called a necrology project, which aims to document every D-Day casualty and fatality among the Allies. And it's harder than you would think. So these numbers I gave you have been revised upward, unfortunately, quite recently. But that's the cost of the Normandy invasion. It's the deadliest day in the war for the USA, deadlier than Pearl Harbor. And it's right up there, of course, among the deadliest in all of American history. So it's very, very meaningful. So there are conclusions. D-Day is only the beginning. It's the first step in a very long, bloody process of defeating Nazi Germany over really almost a year after this. It does not guarantee victory, but now it makes it highly likely. For the U.S., it's the beginning of world leadership. The campaign in Northwest Europe, and of course, subsequently, the Cold War, is really going to happen with the U.S. in the lead. Basically, the American people are going to have a blood debt here. And they're going to say, all right, we tried this in World War I. We've done it again in World War II of expending our sons for the security of Europe. And we are going to continue to invest in that by providing Europe security through the mechanism of NATO. And that continues 70 some odd years later after the founding of NATO. D-Day for the United States then was a kind of a seminal moment. It not only was the beginning of the war in Europe, it's the beginning, as I mentioned, of this kind of internationalist, military, powerful, world-leading United States. And it's part of an allied coalition then, and now we call it NATO at this point, but it's still something of the same kind of thing. Thank you.